Hey everyone, welcome to America in Prophecy. You'd be fascinated to know that America actually is in prophecy. And what we want to do in this broadcast is take a look at Daniel chapter 8. We know that Daniel has prophecies leading all the way up until the end of time. And it's pretty fundamental to understand that the image of Daniel 2, the images that are of the various wild beasts of Daniel 7, and then you have animals that are atonement animals in chapter 8. And what you have here is a succession of images that lead us into an understanding and an insight into prophecy. And what we're going to state here is Daniel 8 with the atonement animals are within the period of the Day of Atonement. It's kind of a reset in Bible prophecy where you go and you prophesy again, according to Revelation chapter 10. And you now look at these two beasts, both that are identified as Greece and of Persia. What's fascinating about this is when you look at it, there are aspects, fundamental governmental aspects to Greece, the he-goat, and of Persia that gives us indication as to characteristics that are of these two main powers that are in the world at the end of time. But let's just go back a little bit and understand that the succession of prophecy in relation to God punishing his people with the abomination of desolation. In other words, during the time of Solomon's temple, God had promised to punish and to discipline his people for becoming a harlot. And you'll know at the end of time, the Bible really depicts a judgment upon a harlot. So this harlot theme is a major theme throughout the scripture in regard to God's people and his temple. So if we take a look at the prophecies in Daniel, and we understand that that prophetic time clock was really starting from the period of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, when God destroyed, through Nebuchadnezzar as a punishing device, Solomon's temple. And so what you have here is the beginning of this succession of prophecy, in which there are secular powers that are in an intimate relationship with the people of God. Now, God is not going to leave us hanging at the end of time saying, well, sorry, I was with you guys at one point in prophecy, but I just kind of left you off to kind of hang in speculation at the end. That's really not how the Bible works. That's not how God works. That's not how his heart works at all. So what we're just going to basically look at is set a premise, because we're going to begin this America in Bible Prophecy series, and we're going to continue it. We're at a very interesting time of America's history, of this Earth's history. And what we're going to really look at is, does America play its part, a major part, in Bible prophecy? So we have to look at this. But if you open your Bibles and you're following along, you could understand that in Daniel 2, we have the head of gold, which is Babylon. You have the chest of silver, which is Medo-Persia. And you have the torso of bronze. And of course, the thighs of that image is Grecia. The legs are Rome. And the feet is the division and declension of the Roman power that now tries to bind itself and meld itself unsuccessfully to an ecclesiastical power. And then you have this end of time feature. Now, the more the book of Daniel progresses, it narrows more succinctly to the end of time. It starts to kind of widen the microscope and broaden the view and get into greater and greater details. So that's what we're going to do, is we're going to move into chapter 8, in which there is a reset. Now these are Day of Atonement animals. And chapter 8 of the book of Daniel is obsessed with the idea that the context of these prophetic beasts are within the Day of Atonement. And we know from Bible prophecy that if you continue following through in Bible prophecy through Daniel 9, Revelation, where you have the 1260 process, you realize that this 1260-year period, in which we had covered on previous broadcasts, is when the papal system had bound itself with the Roman system, and you had a church-state union that went on for 1,260 years, which we call the medieval times, the Dark Ages. Fascinating. Now, that started in 538 when the Justinian Code was developed in a symbiotic relationship and a union with the Roman Catholic Church system. And that became the state orthodoxy, a kind of a Platonia, a Platonic relationship in which the purpose, or for the longevity, or for the idealism of the Roman kind of concept of ruling the world was now linked in with Christendom, the Christian church. Immediately, certain players come on board, which is Islam. Fascinating. So we have an antagonist in this great play. And through that, that is the impetus, that is the antagonist that causes the doctrine of discovery and this entire process in which there are the Crusades and the expansion of this Roman ecclesiastical government with its intent to rule the world. It really is. So if you look at all medieval governmental, legal, social, and all the laws of the medieval system, its purpose is to dominate the world with a pax romana, with a very heavy spiritual ecclesiastical overseeing that goes on. And hence you really have medievalism. Well, there's a great blow, a deadly wound that would happen to that power after 1,260 years. Well, from 538 at the beginning of the Justinian Code, after 1,260 years, 1798, boom. After the shaking and quaking and devastating influence of Protestantism, it culminates into a European revolution in which Napoleon is now a huge player on the scene, and the Justinian Code ends, and then there is the setting up of these various nation states with the Napoleonic Code. So in 1798, we now move from a 1,260-year Justinian Code of the ecclesiastical Rome and civil Roman Justinian power to now really the nation state motif and concept that we have now, today, basically. But it says that that wound will be healed. And in order for that power, this harlot power, this beast power, to be re-established again, it will have to go back to its old system of medievalism. In other words, the Protestant Enlightenment, the Protestant capitalist government and governments and laws and common law and the development of basically the middle class and capitalism and the idea of entrepreneurialism has to be defeated. And there needs to be a restoration of the medieval system for this harlot to now ride this beast power again. You have to understand, a beast represents a governing power. Well, in the end of time, this governing medieval power is restored. And if you have your finger upon the pulse, really, of the times in which we live, you do realize that we're moving into a neo-feudalism. And what's fascinating when we get into Daniel chapter 8, and that's all we're going to do in this study, is we're going to look at the fact that we are making a hard U-turn back into the feudal system. And we could take a look at modern examples as we go through these series of studies in which we could see that back, like in feudal times, you have the destruction of the middle class and you have a technocratic serfdom class in which people are living in a certain impoverished but dependent state upon these overlords. And these overlords virtually own most all the property and the land. And there's this virtue in being poor. And you have these lords that are ruling dynasties and families that have the rule and the power. And then you have the church overseeing this entire process. We might call it an oligarch system, or there's various ideas. But we are hardcore moving into this form of austerity in which it's glorified to be a part of the peasant working class and to be upon a virtual welfare system that we're looking back at the old medieval system. So let's just go into the biblical portion of this. Let's look at Daniel chapter 8, and let's spend a little bit of time going through the scripture. And now let's look at the reset of prophecy. After 1798, you have this Protestant opportunism in which the gospel goes to the entire world. You have the Bible societies, you have Protestant missionaries virtually covering the planet. And for the first time, Rome is rivaled in the world. And it becomes a heavy-duty threat, Protestantism and Protestant missionary work, and also the Protestant work ethic and Protestant legal law enlightenment system. Well, it becomes a huge threat to the medieval feudal system, the medieval system of serfs and overlords and lords and masters and large landowners, in which you would notice now that when you have world leaders moving into us thinking about sustainability, moving into large cities, preserving nature, and having as little of a footprint as possible, and keeping our voices silent, and demoralizing our sense of protest into a society of compliance and fear. With these overlords controlling our liberties, our freedoms, and our speech, our language, our knowledge, our consciousness, and there is a certain amount of consequence for thinking outside of a certain paradigm. Hence, why it's called the Dark Ages. And we are entering into the technocratic, technological, digital Dark Ages. So what we're going to look at is we have moved back into that system. You have great hostility against Protestant capitalism through Romanticism, through all the various ideas in which feudalism, medievalism has stayed alive, and in the ideas of Romanticism, in the ideas of Marxism. And you'll see as we go into our studies how the doctrine of medieval governance has really been on the low with all its great authoritarianism. But it had a resurgence and a revitalization at the beginning of the 20th century with socialism, Marxism, and of course, fascism, with the big push of Romanticism and anarchism and absurdism and all the other isms that happened after this process of the deadly wound is healed, and there is a succession of world wars that were instigated, promulgated, and advanced with the idea of restructuring the world back into a medieval system. Now in the 21st century, it's virtually a completed model with all the technological and all of this social and civic structure in place. And the more we get into these studies, ladies and gentlemen, the more we're going to see how accurate, how relevant, and where we are in Bible prophecy. So let's look at Daniel chapter 8, verse 1, and we're going to hit reset. I do know that these two beasts are atonement animals. And then you have the great prophetic time clock of the Day of Atonement beginning right after the process of after the 1260 years and after 1798, you had the religious awakenings in the United States of America, signaling that there was a phase, a change in the ministration of our heavenly high priest, and there is the great spread of the gospel throughout the entire planet, and it's had its short run. The clock has been running on this Protestant American empire, having the shelf life of all other great empires, and we are now running out of time. There's only one power on this planet that has sustaining power for empires, and Rome seems to have been able to have the staying power to uphold and to give longevity and sustainability to nations that would hand its power over to the See of Rome. And this is the point where America is tottering. And you will see that there is a great hatred, a resentment of Roman medievalism against Protestant capitalism. And this is its finest opportunity to snuff it out and to turn America into the image of the medieval beast. To recapitulate, in a Protestant apostate version of medieval Rome. And we're going to look at that. Daniel chapter 8, verse 1. The 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. So this is a reset. What you have here is the image that's in Daniel 2, and it goes through the histories in regard to Jerusalem and the people of God. And it's an image of a man in which God sees all religion and worship as an idol to be destroyed. And then phase 2, Daniel is speaking prophetically so of wild beasts, which are familiar to Israelites of Leviticus chapter 26, speaking that when God disciplines his people, he sees his people as a flock in which wild beasts will be used to discipline and to punish, discourage his flock, and to bring them back into the shepherd's fold. Wild, unclean animals. In the book of Revelation, you see the amalgamation of these things, of these secular powers, all pulled together into this Neoplatonistic, syncretistic, last day power that is likened unto Grecia with a leopard-like body. This leopard beast correlates to Greece, Hellenism. And then you have the Persian concept, which is this ram, Ra'em. It is a lamb-like beast in Revelation. And it grows up very similar to the life of Cyrus, in which there was great intrigue, and he was raised as a shepherd and then became adopted into the king's court, finding out that he was actually born from the king's granddaughter. He rises up and becomes a great deliverer of God's people, and that is also paralleled by America playing a role in being a harbor, a safe house, a safe harbor for the people of God during the great European Protestant persecution. Became a wilderness, which there was great peace and solace, and the development of a new beast rising up from the land. Well, there's always been a hatred, a bitterness, a resentment that Protestantism, who was considered an act of rebellion, a Luciferian movement by Rome, which saw itself as the Christian church. Protestantism was looked upon as a prodigal son. The Great Rebellion. But Protestantism became prosperous and succeeded, and nations came out from the iron grip of medieval Rome. Germany, England, France, Austria, Switzerland, all were becoming financially liberated from Rome, no longer under the iron grip of ecclesiastical Rome, medievalism. Well, the Americas were formed, and it pushed itself towards the west, towards the north, and towards the south. And it develops into this mighty power, to the chagrin and the disappointment and the rage and hatred of Rome, that has always hated this runaway slave. So let's continue reading verse 2, Daniel 8. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was in Shushan, which is the lilies, the lily of the valley, in a dark place, in a place where in the time of Esther, where God's people were all living, and it was a kind of a valley, the mouth of a river, and they were in a great time of trouble there, in a dark place of persecution. In the palace, which is in the province of Elam, which means eternal. Now we're going to look at the very important meaning of words in this. And I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai. Well, that is the word really for mighty leaders. This is a great cosmic conflict of principalities and powers. Verse 3, then I lifted up my eyes, and I saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram. And if you will look into the word re'em in Hebrew, you will see that it is a lamb-like beast that grows up on land and is untamable and begins to speak as a dragon. It is translated in some translations to be buffalo. Fascinating. The history and relationship of the United States of America and its symbol, the buffalo. And it had two horns. And the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the other came up last. So there is this dual power of civic and religious, mimicking the medieval church of civic and religious power. Verse 4 says, and I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, southward, the Americas, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his own will and became powerful. The history of America. Verse 5 of Daniel 8 says, and as I was considering, behold, a he-goat. Now, this is an Azazel goat. This is Day of Atonement. This is a ram and a he-goat. Both are animals during the Day of Atonement. Beginning after 1798, prophetic, scholarly, and well-done exegete of this and the historical context land this power from the decree of Artaxerxes of Persia. There is a Persian connection to this power, and this is a 2,300 Day of Atonements in which there is a decree to restore, rebuild Jerusalem, 457 BC, and lands on 1844 AD. America is in full swing during the Industrial Revolution, prior to a civil war. Interesting, the role that Rome played in the Civil War. Look it up. This he-goat, this Grecian, Hellenistic, Neoplatonistic, amalgamated beast, as depicted in the book of Revelation, it says, came from the west. It's a different word for west. It's fascinating. This word comes from a dark place. It's where we get the word Arab from, Arabok, or darkness. It's not the same word as this ram beast coming to the west, pushed towards the west. This west is coming from a place of darkness. In other words, a deadly wound was healed, and it's emerging from an abyss. Came from the west of the whole face of the earth and touched not the ground, an ecclesiastical power, not ruling in any specific place. And the goat had a notable horn between its eyes. Daniel makes it clear of this little horn power. Papal, ecclesiastical authority. Verse 6 says, and he came to the ram, to this, quote, Persianistic religious liberty. You see, Cyrus, who was prophesied of in the book of Isaiah, chapter 44 and 45, which means really a king rising from the east, kings of the east. Look that phrase up in the book of Revelation, depicting a Messiah figure in typology, delivering God's people from Babylon so they could go and restore and rebuild Jerusalem to reestablish religious liberty. Look at the Cyrus cylinder, and you'll realize, even through Thomas Jefferson, that America was patterned after Persia because it was the great and first defender of religious liberty and was the impetus of a United States of separate nation states. And it's the idea of nation states existing, governing themselves, but being in a united system through an internet system. Oh, come on, David. Cyrus talking about the internet. Well, he developed the first internet, which is called the postal system. Fascinating how the postal system is playing such a big part of events today. The postal system was developed by Persia. And in fact, if you want to look at the book of Revelation, the 7 letters to the 7 churches was really developed by the Persian government. And it started, the first dump of the postal system of letters would start at Ephesus, and then it would go to Smyrna and so on. And finally, its last stop was Laodicea. That was the circuit of the postal system. Those were the main postal hubs that were a gift from Persia, Persian rule. Little trivia. So, verse 6, the ram that had the 2 horns, which was seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram. Now, this is talking about this he-goat power was charging itself towards this ram, this 2-horned power, out of great fury. Verse 7 of Daniel 8, and I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler. And the word choler, it's an English word, but it just means with great resentment and bitterness. There are some old scores to settle here. Rome never forgets. The papal power never forgets. Against him smote the ram, this Persianistic beast of liberating God's people, giving them a safe land to restore the gospel power, given its sovereignty again. That's what the Persian power did when they were delivered from Babylon. And it's played out during the antitypical Day of Atonement, post 1844. A Protestant power. Smote the ram and broke his 2 horns, and there was no more power in that ram to stand before him, before this powerful globalist, Neoplatonistic, neo-feudal, medieval beast coming from the dark pit, from the dark ages. Restored power. Cast him down to the ground, stamped upon him. There was none that could deliver that 2-horned liberty, ram, lamb-like beast power. And no one could deliver the lamb out of the hand of this Hellenistic, medieval, ecclesiastical power. Daniel chapter 8, we go down to verse 8, moving on. Therefore he, the goat, this Azazel, this scapegoat, this goat of rebellion. Azaz for Azazel means impudent face, defiant towards the sanctuary in heaven. casting the sanctuary and the high priestly ministration of Jesus Christ, in which Protestantism was the great defender of. You're not saved by the magisterium and the priestcraft of the Roman Catholic system, in which it sees itself as a crypto-Judaistic priesthood power upon this earth. No. Protestantism came from a reformation within the Catholic Church, in which there were people, ironically, reading the original documents, reading the early manuscripts as philologists. What does that mean? Well, during the Crusades, ironically, these crusaders, these Templars, these various other crusaders that were part of these medieval lords that were pushing their way into the Middle East, into Jerusalem, into these Nestorian church communities, were gaining manuscripts from all over, bringing them back, and Rome accumulated them. And the young scholars in the time of the Enlightenment, which there were great interest in the original languages, no longer Latin. They actually wanted to know Greek and Hebrew. They didn't want to read the dogmas anymore or the encyclicals. They just wanted to read copies of manuscripts of the New Testament. There's a great fascination among these young scholars, these young men who became fascinated to become originalists. They were curious about, well, have we gone off the rails? What is Christianity all about? The Crusades developed a treasure trove of manuscripts, and they became obsessed with dating these things and finding the oldest, possibly the closest to the original documents in papyri to the apostles' writings. And there became an obsession with canonization. And they were poring over these documents and saying, I think we've gone wrong somewhere in doctrine and in ecclesiastical organization. It seems to us, from these New Testament documents, from the apostles' writings, there is a sanctuary in heaven. There's a priesthood in heaven. We can access God not through a human / pagan / angel worship, saint worship hierarchy that looks a little more like Hinduism than it really does Christianity. We can just pray in the name of Christ and get direct access to the Father as an individual, not through the institutions in which Rome, as a Grecian Hellenistic power, with its pantheistic view of institutions, that somehow these institutions are organic material of God. Somehow the institutions and loyalty to them, the voice that comes from them, is the voice of God and divine. And these young textualists, philologists, originalists were reading these manuscripts and saying, we need to reform the church. Oh, where are these young people now? And so they wanted to see a reformation. Well, it didn't go as they thought. It seemed that there was religious zeal within the Catholic magisterium and its entire system. They thought, well, in our monasteries, through our monastic schools, surely our leaders will share in the zeal and excitement of restoring the church back to her original position. Humble, deconstructed into a body of believers that held on to the priesthood of Jesus Christ, and that we humbled ourselves before that God, and we got rid of this strange, bizarre, bloated beast. And they started calling its own church the Antichrist system. Well, they became disciplined and punished, and They had to go into the Inquisition, and they were questioned, and they were called heretics. And these reformers were being burned, punished, made to be as a cautionary tale to the rest of the medieval society. And then it developed. Martin Luther nailed up the 95 Theses on Halloween. It became a protest. And ever since then, this power has hated anything to do with this protest that declares that it has no ecclesiastical institutional power to forgive, that it's blasphemous to say so. They thought it would easily be squashed since it was a drunken German monk with a temper problem who was only Dominican would somehow just be a hiccup in the history of the church. It didn't work out that way. So, great hatred and rage, verse 9. Out of one of them came forth a little horn, waxed exceedingly great, towards the south, towards the east, towards the pleasant land. It's talking about its fight is the fight of the Tower of Babel. It is trying to disrupt, replace, confuse, do violence, molest, do damage to the doctrine that you can access the righteousness of God through Christ in confessing your sins and Christ mediating his righteousness in your stead. And this system made a war on that doctrine of justification by faith. Waxed exceedingly great towards the pleasant land. Verse 10, it says that it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the hosts of the stars to the ground and trampled the sanctuary underfoot, doing great violence to the doctrine appointing believers to our mediator in heaven, and casting our eyes and focus and assuming that there's power in these ecclesiastical figures, not unlike the Pharisees, Sadducees, rulers of the time of Christ. A great rebellion. Verse 11 of Daniel 8, it said, he magnified himself even unto the prince of the host, and by him the daily, the Talmud, the high priestly ministration of Christ's infinite and unceasing mediation and intercession of righteousness in place of man was taken away, was removed, was replaced. And the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Verse 12 of Daniel 8 says, and the host was given to him against that daily Talmud, that ministration of Christ standing there in our place. Protestantism started to wipe the dust off of this doctrine, and it became the ram's battering ram to this great, majestic, medieval, dark ages, ecclesiastical superpower. And it was the beginning of the end. And there was great rage and hatred and resentment for what is called the Great Protestant Rebellion. Barely survived it when all the kings of Europe and of the rest of the Near East was moving towards the gospel. A revival of primitive Christianity close to the book of Acts, going toe-to-toe with this counterfeit ecclesiastical medieval Roman power. For 1,260 years, thought that it was close to achieving its goals. You see, when the Enlightenment happened, Protestantism was awakening. It started to panic and started sending its Jesuits and its missionaries with militaristic power from Spain, from Rome, with the encyclicals to the Doctrine Discovery, Terra Nullius, and the various other encyclicals that fundamentally said, doomed diverses, basically saying, hey, the world is yours. And go as fast as you can, send as many ships in every direction in this world, the new lands that are out there, before they're claimed by this Protestantism that's taking hold, and that's trading in spices, in cotton, in sugar, in bronze, in gold, in precious metals, in animals, in grain, in corn, in wheat, in fruits. And all of a sudden, the great race to rule the world from the 1500s, the 16th century, all the way into the deadly wound at the end of the 18th century, late 1700s. Well, that was very devastating. Napoleon gave a deadly blow. Napoleonic laws that empowered the people to be capitalists, to involve them in trade, to free up the peasant class, and to create the middle class. This stripped away world dominion from this he-goat, leopard, amalgamated, Hellenistic, Alexander the Great type power of Rome. So, it attacked the ministration of Jesus Christ, in which Protestantism was declaring with great clarion clearness, freeing up people from the mental, spiritual, soul slavery that you had from this medieval ecclesiastical power. You see, the lower class weren't allowed to read, were they? But now, Jefferson and America was setting up libraries, the concept of liberty, to self-educate, to now read, that it was a part of the public trust to educate yourself, to become a part of enlightenment, to gain access to knowledge and technology, that you could become self-empowered. Do you think this he-goat power had anything but bitterness and rage when this ram-like beast was finally taking off and waxing great? Now, it was removing all of its ecclesiastical power by the declaration of justification by faith and the priesthood of Jesus Christ, and that each man can access the very throne room of God through Christ alone. Well, this became a battle over the throne of God. Who has dominion over that throne? It says that it magnified itself even to the prince of the host, and by him, the ministration of Jesus Christ was taken away. The sanctuary was cast down. This is exalting itself above the stars. This is exactly what Satan did in Isaiah chapter 14. Now this is a recapitulation of Lucifer himself in his rebellion. Now it's done in a churchcraft, civic, ecclesiastical power that's been identified, Rome. Protestantism expressing itself through capitalism, through the middle class, through entrepreneurialism, through the library system, through the postal system, through mass communication, through laws of common law that would not regard a man according to his class, to his empire, family classified system in which all the levels of social classism, you're stuck. You could be the most knowledgeable person in the world. You can have the greatest talents. Doesn't matter. You're stuck in your class. Welcome to feudalism. If you're part of the high class and you're the biggest knucklehead and fool in the world, doesn't matter. Doesn't change anything. Sound familiar? Sound like the classes that are being developed now? Working class, technocratic class. Sit there and be happy. Enjoy what little you get. Inflation is so great. Gas price is so great that all you can do is just work to live. Nobody really owns their own home, do they? Everyone's in debt to the banks. Everyone's in debt to the feudal lords. And then you had the ruling class, the young tech giants, with their indulgences and their power even over governance. Where there's even the futility of a quasi-Protestant governmental system in which right now we are seeing this he-goat power with great hatred is deconstructing this system, and the ram-like beast will not stand. Because it says that this he-goat power practiced and prospered. Daniel 8:13 says, "Then I heard one saint speaking to another saint." In other words, this is Gabriel speaking to Christ, Palmone, as a judge during this great time of the Day of Atonement, because we're looking at the issues of the sacrificial system, priesthood, and prophetically speaking, is post 1798, in which we are now looking at Day of Atonement beasts. And the issue now is the heavenly sanctuary in the time of judgment. Say to that one certain saint, Palmone, and that's certain saint, as you can look in the margins, how long shall be the vision concerning this daily, this Tamid, this attack against the ministration of Christ and the doctrine of justification by faith through an ecclesiastical churchcraft civil system that obscures the great Protestant doctrine and the great benefits and liberty and blessing that Protestantism has been to society. Notice how capitalism has been demonized. Entrepreneurialism, demonized in all the movies, radio show hosts, politicians for the last 100 years have talked nothing but the evils of capitalism and exalting Marxism, socialism, romanticism, medievalism, feudalism. It's there. It's there through the artists. It's there through the music. It's there in art. It's there in mass communication. It's there in academia. And if you were to look at our entire Grecian academic system, which is represented in the Bible, this leopard-bodied beast, this dragon power, our entire educational system, which teaches our ideology, our politics, our worldview, all of academia, and the indoctrination of academia has been in hatred of capitalism in our own country. And the exaltation and glorification. And why do you think the students, college students, think the way they do? Why do you think your good Christian children, boys and girls, go into college and they come out with this whole other idea? It's not secularism, ladies and gentlemen. It's medievalism. The social justice movement, look it up. It comes from the medieval church. The whole idea of Malthusianism, in which there's limited resources on this earth, and it has to be given over to responsible overseers, and people are making too much of a negative impression upon nature, in which in the medieval world you had to live in these giant metroplexes. There was no suburb. There was no having a country home unless you were the rich and powerful. You see, these ideas are already taken over England. Did you know that 1%? There's 1% of people in England that own 50% of the land. That, ladies and gentlemen, is feudalism. Its push for Marxism and socialism is feudalism. These large estates in which people work for these large estates, and you can't own land, in which the government takes over the land, or these large ruling class people take over the land, and you have to live in these large cities, and you are under the mercy, the social planning and engineering of these overlords. You're only allowed to think, talk, and you are punished for speaking or thinking outside of the prescribed narrative. That is now in America. The medieval system is here. Globalism is medievalism. Socialism, Marxism, fascism, these are just labels, ladies and gentlemen. All this concept of austerity, in which we're handing over all of our power to the social engineers, is the mentality and the governing rule of medievalism. I have books in my library that are written by Jesuits that are frothing at the mouth, excited about the downfall of the United States of America, because it represents the downfall of global Protestantism, in which the United States of America has been a shining light. So it won't become the Catholic Republic that they have hoped in the most obvious way. America is about to become the Catholic Republic in a defunct, fundamental way that gets to keep the facade, the label of Protestantism, but that has already been eaten out, carved out. And you'll see that the form of Protestantism and its foreign policies, its right think, this is the way you're supposed to think, its institutes, its liberal institutes, its globalist agenda. You see, you're now seeing the death throes of a more Protestant idea of nation states and not meddling in international affairs, and uplifting entrepreneurialism and self-education, and not having to be a part of an elite class where there is no upward mobility unless you're part of an empire family. Ladies and gentlemen, you're now seeing the death of all the Protestant virtues of republicanism, Protestantism, the Enlightenment, free thinking, that has all been taken over. And we handed it over to these tech giants, these social justice movements, and all these other medieval notions. What we're looking at is the deconstruction of families, the deconstruction of the family class, You see, when you're looking at Marxism, a lot of people think, well, that's just, or Romanticism. You know what that is? Well, that's the empowerment of women. No. If you do your research on it, all it is the deconstruction of the family. See, Planned Parenthood is a part of medievalism, as strange as it is. You see, Black Americans would have so much more power if they didn't have eugenicists start Planned Parenthood through Margaret Sanger, which is a part of the medieval system, to limit the Black peasant class. Why is there only 13% of this great nation? Why is there only 13% Blacks? Because of the abortion genocide. There should be much more of a population of Black Americans if they were not sold the bill of goods, that they were given great liberty and freedom and empowerment by murdering their babies from their womb. Margaret Sanger was an avowed eugenicist. And this idea of seeing the planet as a farm, and that the people, the peasants, are the different animals on the farm, and how they looked at the Blacks, these medievalists. It's sad because we should be, at this point of our history, many more successful, entrepreneurial, not through handouts, not through Marxism, not through socialism, not through medievalism, not through these overlords tipping the balance with their fingers, but by being participants of this middle-class Protestant entrepreneurial system. So why is 13% of the population, which is even less because if you just look at the 6% of the population are Black males, committing 50% of violent crimes in America? Is there a collective frustration, a rage that is deep in the subconscious of the Black American man who's been emasculated, who's been removed from the home, who's been treated like a baby, an infant, barely escaping the abortionists' clamps, and then given a novel role in society, relegated to sports and minstrel musics? You see, muse, was for the illiterate class in medieval time. They were the muses. They were the minstrels. They were the clowns. Admired, like you would admire animals. This is the sad fate of medievalism that was well disguised in Americanism. This is the horrors of what we're going to have to look at. Tonight, we're going to finish this broadcast, hopefully stimulating your mind, getting you to begin to look at Daniel chapter 8, realizing globalism, Romanism, Catholicism, well disguised through these medieval these neo-feudal globalist dreams in which Rome has not finished her rebellion against the sanctuary of God in heaven. You are now witnessing the last throes of the protective Protestantism that was there as a safe harbor, as a hiding place for the gospel. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in the last days.